In 1963, Katharine Graham's world ended. Her husband, Phil Graham, a brilliant but deeply troubled genius, died by suicide, leaving her a 46-year-old widow, utterly broken and terrified. She was a woman raised to be invisible, programmed by her mother and her husband to believe she was second-rate. She was never expected to run her family's newspaper, the Washington Post, and yet this was the same woman who, less than a decade later, would risk her entire empire to publish the Pentagon Papers and confront a corrupt president during Watergate. This is the story of a survivor. It is the story of how America's most insecure woman stepped out of the shadow of personal tragedy to become the most powerful woman in the nation, the queen of an era, and the guest of honor at Truman Capote's legendary black and white ball. The world Kay Graham, born Katharine Meyer, entered in 1917 was not the world of old aristocracy. It was the world of new money and power. Her father, Eugene Meyer, was a legend. He was a financial genius, a self-made Jew who amassed a huge fortune in a world largely run by WASPS. He was not an inheritor, he was a conqueror. Strict and ambitious, he once served as chairman of the Federal Reserve, a giant in every sense. But if Eugene was power, her mother, Agnes Ernst Meyer, was intellect and ice. Agnes was a brilliant woman, a journalist, an art critic, a multilingual scholar. She was tall, intimidating, and deeply self-absorbed. She scorned her husband's commerce and finance, and she viewed motherhood as a distraction from her higher intellectual pursuits. Kay grew up in a magnificent Washington, D.C. house filled with every material thing, yet it was an emotional wasteland. She was a ghost in her own home. She was not a boy. She had 4 siblings. And in a family that valued academic achievement and assertiveness, Kay was shy, awkward, and sensitive. She craved her mother's affection, but that door was locked tight. Agnes Meyer was a critical, distant, and often cruel mother. She openly favored her sons and viewed Kay's sensitivity as a weakness. As Kay later wrote in her Pulitzer Prize-winning autobiography, Personal History, she spent her childhood with an overwhelming sense of my own inadequacy. This core psychological wound was formed early. Kay believed she was not smart, not attractive, and not important. She was programmed to believe her role was to stand in the background, supporting the important men in her life. In 1933, when Kay was 16, her father, Eugene, did a seemingly bizarre thing. He purchased a failing newspaper at an auction. That paper was the Washington Post. We must understand this. The Washington Post in 1933 was not the Washington Post we know. It was a bottom-tier rag. It was the 5th best paper in a town with 5 papers. It had no prestige, no readership, and was bleeding money. Eugene Meyer's friends thought he was insane. But Eugene saw something. He saw a tool for influence in the nation's capital. He poured millions into it, treating it as a passion project, a civic duty. And Kay, the young woman studying at Vassar and then the University of Chicago, took an interest. She worked at the paper during summer breaks. She loved the hustle of the newsroom. It was the first place she felt purpose. She even went to San Francisco after graduation and worked as a reporter for $25 a week. For the first time, she was Kay Meyer, a reporter, not Eugene Meyer's daughter. But that independence was temporary. Her legacy awaited her, and it came in the form of a man who would shape and nearly destroy the rest of her life. His name was Phil Graham, and he was a storm. When Kay Meyer met him in 1939, he was everything she was not. He was a Harvard law graduate, a clerk for Supreme Court Justices Felix Frankfurter and Stanley Reed. He was brilliant, dangerously charismatic, hilarious, and possessed a near-manic energy. He was the brightest star of his generation, and he paid attention to Kay. To Kay, who always felt like a shadow, Phil's attention was like seeing the sun for the first time. He made her laugh. He made her feel seen, adored. They fell passionately in love and married in 1940. And this is where the tragedy began to take shape. Kay's father, Eugene Meyer, was also mesmerized by Phil. He saw in Phil the son he never had, a brilliant, charismatic successor who could take his paper to the next level. Eugene spent the next years grooming Phil for the takeover. And Kay? She did what she was taught to do. She stepped back. She abandoned her nascent journalism career to become Mrs. Phil Graham, the supportive wife, the mother of their 4 children. In 1946, Eugene Meyer was ready to retire. He made a decision that would echo for decades, one that simultaneously built the empire and reinforced his daughter's deepest insecurities. He gave the paper not to his daughter Kay, who had worked there and loved it, but to his son-in-law, Phil. He sold the voting shares to Phil for the symbolic price of $1. To the world, it was a smart business move. To Kay, it was a devastating psychological message. It confirmed her darkest fear, that she was not good enough, that her sole value was to serve as a conduit, a bridge to hand her father's legacy to a more worthy man. She wrote, "It never occurred to me to question that the paper would be given to him, not me." And Phil flourished. Throughout the 1950s, he was the king of Washington. He turned the Washington Post into a force. He bought its competitor, the Times Herald. In 1961, he acquired Newsweek magazine, turning the Washington Post Company into a multinational media empire. He was more than a publisher. He was a kingmaker. He was a close friend and confidant to senators, judges, and presidents. He helped persuade John F. Kennedy to choose Lyndon B. Johnson as his running mate in 1960. And Kay? She was the perfect Georgetown hostess. The Graham's home was the center of power. Her dinner parties were legendary, where Democratic and Republican politicians met, where journalists debated policymakers. Kay was a gracious, intelligent, yet always silent hostess. She was there to pour the drinks, ensure the food was excellent, and listen to the men talk. She was Phil's shadow. As their friend, the journalist James Reston famously said Phil would talk and Kay would bring the ashtrays. But there was a terrible secret in this gilded marriage, a secret Kay hid from the world with frightening tenacity. The brilliant, magnetic man she married was not just high energy, he was sick. Phil Graham suffered from bipolar disorder, a serious mental illness that in the 1950s was little understood and heavily stigmatized. For years, Kay wrestled with his demons. When he was manic, he was the genius Phil, charming, tirelessly working, conquering the world. But when he was depressed, he plunged into darkness, becoming cruel, abusive, and self-destructive. And his cruelty was often directed squarely at Kay. He preyed on her insecurities, weaponizing them. He told her she was stupid. He told her she was boring. He told her she was unworthy of him. And Kay, who had been programmed by her mother to believe this, believed him. She believed she was a burden, that she was the cause of his problems. In the late 1950s, Phil's illness worsened. He began to drink heavily, and then he began an affair. It was not a discreet affair. It was a public, brutal humiliation, fueled by mania. The woman was Robin Webb, a young journalist working in the Paris bureau of Newsweek. Phil openly abandoned Kay and their children for Robin. He flew her around the world, introducing her in Washington society as the love of his life. He didn't just leave Kay, he tried to destroy her. He told all their friends, the friends who had dined at her table for years, that Kay was a terrible wife, a horrible mother. He mocked her publicly at parties. He called her a dowdy old woman. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted everything. He wanted the Washington Post. He wanted Newsweek. He wanted the house. He threatened to strip her of everything her father had handed over to him. For Kay, this was hell on earth. She was 45, humiliated, abandoned, and utterly broken. Her greatest fear had come true. She was not just useless, she was disposable. She endured this humiliation with a stoic silence, trying to hold her family together, shielding her children from the chaos. Phil's final collapse occurred in 1963. His mania peaked. He flew to Phoenix for a newspaper convention and gave a disastrous speech. He was drunk, rambling, insulting editors and advertisers. He took off his shoes and began screaming about John F. Kennedy. He had completely lost control. His editors called Kay in Washington, begging her to do something. And this is the moment, the first pivotal moment of transformation. Kay, the woman who had spent her life deferring to this man who believed she was weak, made an iron-willed decision. She flew to Phoenix. She did not fly to placate him. She flew to capture him. She assembled a team of doctors, flew to his hotel room, and confronted her raving husband. He screamed at her, cursed her, but she did not flinch. She allowed the doctors to tranquilize him. They strapped him to a gurney and put him on a private plane. Kay Graham kidnapped her husband and committed him to the Chestnut Lodge Mental Hospital in Maryland. It was the bravest, most terrifying act of her life. She saved the company from his destruction. She saved him from himself. Over the next few months at Chestnut Lodge, Phil seemed to recover. The mania subsided. He reverted to the charming, apologetic Phil she loved. He told doctors he was well. He told Kay he loved her, that he wanted to come home, that he wanted to mend the family. The doctors warned her. They said he wasn't ready. But Kay, desperate for forgiveness and reconciliation, believed him. She was torn. She wanted her family back. In August 1963, she agreed to let Phil come home for the weekend at their Virginia farm, Glen Welby. It was a Saturday, August 3rd. The morning seemed normal. They ate lunch. Phil seemed tired and went upstairs to take a nap. Kay was downstairs. Then she heard a gunshot. It echoed through the quiet house, an explosion that shattered the world, as she later described it. She ran upstairs. The bathroom door was locked. She knew. Instantly she knew. They broke the door down. Phil Graham, 48, the genius who built the empire, the man she loved and feared, had killed himself with a shotgun. Katharine Graham's world had ended. In an instant, she was a 46-year-old widow, left with 4 children, a wobbling media empire, and an inexpressible depth of grief and guilt. Everyone, the New York bankers, her editors, even her mother, expected her to do the sensible thing, sell the paper, hand it over to a capable man to run, retreat into the life of a wealthy widow. They did not know who Kay Graham was. To be honest, she didn't know either. Days after the funeral, in a meeting with male lawyers and advisors who were debating who to sell to, Kay Graham, the woman who always remained silent in meetings, lifted her head, and she spoke. She said she would not sell. She said the company was not for sale. She said she was going to take over. The men in the room were stunned. They thought she was mad with grief. They failed to recognize that the woman sitting before them was no longer Mrs. Phil Graham. That woman died with her husband in that bathroom. This was a new person, one forged in tragedy, and she was about to change America forever. To declare a takeover and to actually take over were 2 entirely different worlds. Stepping out of her husband's funeral, the woman still paralyzed by grief and haunted by a lifetime of insecurity, now had to step into a world, journalism, Wall Street, completely dominated by men who did not believe she could do it. Her transformation was not an overnight one. It was a slow, painful metamorphosis, beginning with a key hiring decision, announced to the world at a lavish costume ball, and tested by fire in the most audacious financial decision of her life, taking the company public just before the first political firestorm struck. When Katharine Graham stood up from that meeting, she may have claimed her ownership, but she did not feel like a leader. She felt like an imposter. She was 46, and for all 46 of those years, every man of authority in her life, from the great Eugene Meyer to the genius Phil Graham, had implicitly told her she was not smart enough, not tough enough, not capable enough. Now they were all gone, and she was left alone with a wobbling media empire, a company she understood emotionally, but knew nothing about running operationally. The world she entered in 1963 was not just a world of men, it was a fortress of men. Journalism, like Wall Street and Washington politics, was an exclusive club of cigar-smoking, hard-drinking gentlemen. They were the ones who had made the decisions with Phil Graham, who were accustomed to a charismatic, decisive man at the top. And then Kay walked in, a soft-spoken, trembling, black-clad widow, whom they still patronizingly called Mrs. Graham. They treated her with a condescending politeness, patted her head, shielded her from the unpleasant details of business, and whispered behind her back, waiting for the inevitable day she would sell the company to a real man. Kay's insecurity was a thick fog that blanketed her every move. She described walking into her own company's board meetings as if stepping off a cliff. She would spend hours before meetings, rehearsing what she would say, only for the moment to come, and her voice would falter, she would stammer, and she would feel a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She was terrified of asking questions, believing her questions would expose her colossal ignorance. She wrote that she felt she was standing precariously on high heels, a perfect image for a woman thrust into a role she was unprepared to hold. She was the owner, but she acted like an intern. For the first few years after Phil's death, she ran the company by proxy. She relied heavily on the male advisors Phil had left behind, especially Fritz Beebe, a trusted lawyer who became her right-hand man. She didn't try to be Phil. She just tried to keep the ship from sinking. She was still Mrs. Phil Graham, the caretaker of her husband's legacy, not Kay Graham, the creator of her own. Her social life changed too. She was no longer the Georgetown hostess. She was a widow. Her old friends didn't know what to say to her. They couldn't understand why she would want to bury herself in balance sheets and union negotiations. She had become an anomaly, a woman who held real power. The real transformation didn't start with a heroic act. It started with a hiring decision. By 1965, the Washington Post was still an important paper, but it lacked edge. It was seen as a respectable local paper, but not a true rival to the New York Times. Kay knew the paper needed a new voice, a new energy. She needed a great executive editor. And she knew exactly who she wanted, a decision that was both obvious and immensely personally frightening. His name was Ben Bradlee. Bradlee was everything Kay was not, and alarmingly everything Phil Graham once was. He was a loud, profane Boston Brahmin who was Harvard educated. He had a swaggering self-confidence, a magnetic charm, and an absolute impatience with nonsense. He was a true journalist who had worked in the Paris bureau of Newsweek and was a close friend and neighbor of John F. Kennedy. He was the embodiment of Camelot glamour and power. For Kay, hiring Bradlee was a huge psychological gamble. She wasn't just hiring an editor. She was voluntarily bringing another version of Phil Graham, a charismatic, overwhelming man whom she feared would despise her, into the center of her professional life. She was intimidated by him. She feared he would see her as a stupid boss, a social widow. But she also knew with an instinct she didn't realize she possessed, that he was exactly what the paper needed. She needed his arrogance, his audacity. So she did it. She invited him to lunch and made the offer. Their relationship would go on to define American journalistic history, but it did not start as a friendship. It started as a tense negotiation between two complete strangers. Bradley was a man's man. He had never worked for a woman, and he certainly didn't intend to be micromanaged by one. Kay, for her part, spent the early years of their relationship going to extreme lengths not to interfere, calling him Mr. Bradley, and frequently retreating from confrontations. Bradley's arrival changed the newsroom immediately. He brought in a team of young, talented journalists whom he called his army. He wanted to create creative tension. He wanted to catch up to the New York Times. He changed the Post from a paper that respectfully reported government events to one that was investigative, skeptical, and willing to dig. He brought the growl to the paper, and it was against the backdrop of this new professional ascendancy that the fateful social event took place, the black and white ball of 1966. When Truman Capote announced he was throwing the century's greatest party in honor of Katharine Graham, New York society was stunned. Kay Graham, they whispered. They expected Babe Paley or a European princess. But Capote, with his genius intuition for power, saw what no one else did. He wasn't throwing a party for little Kay, Phil's timid wife. He was honoring Mrs. Graham, the powerful publisher of the Washington Post, the only woman in America with the potential to become a force equal to the men running the country. The party was not merely a social event, it was Kay's unofficial coronation. It was Capote's moment of telling the world, look at this woman, she matters. To Kay, the party was an agony of anxiety. She worried about her dress, about whether she would disappoint Capote. But when she walked into the Plaza Ballroom wearing her mask and saw the entire power structure of America assembled there for her, something shifted. She had survived Phil's public humiliation. She had survived his funeral. She had survived the terrifying first years of running the company. She could certainly survive a party. The black and white ball was the end of an era for American society. But for Kay Graham, it was the real beginning. The late 1960s were her school. While America was torn apart by the Vietnam War, civil rights protests, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, Kay Graham was quietly learning how to be the boss. Her relationship with Ben Bradley was evolving. It was no longer one of intimidation. It was becoming one of thorny mutual respect. She started to challenge him. She asked questions. She forced him to explain his decisions. Bradley, for his part, was starting to realize that behind the timid exterior of Mrs. Graham was a steel will. She might hate confrontation, but she would not back down when she believed she was right, especially when it concerned the integrity of the paper. She had learned a crucial lesson from her father. The owner must protect his journalists. A trust began to form, a partnership that would soon be tested by fire. The first major test had nothing to do with journalism. It had to do with money. By 1971, Kay realized that for the Post to truly compete with the New York Times, to invest in more reporters and foreign bureaus, they needed a massive infusion of capital. The only way to do that was to take the Washington Post company public on the stock market. This was a wrenching decision. Going public meant giving up a piece of family control. It meant exposing the company's financials to all of Wall Street's scrutiny. And it meant Kay, the woman still afraid to speak in meetings, would have to travel to New York and convince a room full of investment bankers that she, a widow with no business degree, was a safe bet. It was a disastrous performance. The bankers patronized her. They asked condescending questions. At one critical investors' dinner, a banker even turned to her lawyer and asked, "Does the little guy really know what she's doing?" She was furious, but she held her composure. She pushed through it. In June 1971, the Washington Post Company was officially listed on the American Stock Exchange. It was a massive success. Kay Graham had proven she was more than a caretaker. She was a genuine CEO. She had gambled on herself and won. Her confidence, for the first time in her life, began to take root. And it came not a moment too soon, because exactly at that moment, when her company was at its most financially vulnerable, when her stock was raw and sensitive, the biggest political firestorm of the 20th century landed on her doorstep. Just days after the company went public, on June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from a massive classified Pentagon report, revealing how successive American governments had lied to the public about the Vietnam War. They were the Pentagon Papers. 3 days later, the Nixon administration, citing national security, sued the Times and received a court order banning them from further publication. For the first time in American history, a newspaper had been gagged by its own government. In Washington, Ben Bradlee was going insane with jealousy. The Times had landed the biggest story in a generation, and the Post had been left behind. He roared at his reporters, "Get me those papers." And then one of his reporters, Ben Bagdikian, found the source, Daniel Ellsberg. Bagdikian flew to Boston, met Ellsberg in a shabby motel room, and flew back to Washington with a box containing 4,000 pages of classified documents. That evening, the Post's entire senior editorial team gathered at Ben Bradlee's home. They spread the thousands of pages across the living room floor, trying to piece them together, searching for a story. Simultaneously, the company's legal team and her Wall Street bankers were calling Kay Graham in a panic. They told her, "You cannot publish this." They pointed out that the New York Times had been blocked by a court. If the Post willfully defied that order, they could not only be held in contempt of court, they could be criminally prosecuted for espionage, and most critically to the bankers, this illegal act would violate the terms of their new stock offering. It could financially ruin the company. They could lose everything. The lawyers said no. The businessmen said no. The final call came to Kay Graham, who was hosting a dinner party at home. She was caught between two forces. On one side were the lawyers and bankers, the wise men she had been taught her entire life to listen to, telling her she would destroy her father's legacy. On the other was Ben Bradlee, her arrogant, impassioned editor, roaring over the phone, saying that if she didn't print, the Washington Post would forever be a second-rate paper, and that she would betray the very purpose of a free press. Everything in Kay Graham's past, her insecurity, her respect for authority, her fear of disappointing powerful men, was screaming at her to stop. But the new woman, the CEO who took the company public, the owner who trusted her editor, was feeling something else. Trapped between financial ruin and journalistic integrity, with the pressure of the entire Nixon administration bearing down on her, Katharine Graham, the woman who was afraid to ask questions in meetings, had to make the decision. And she had to make it immediately. She was about to cross the point of no return, and that victory would come at a price. That decision not only propelled her and the New York Times to a historic victory at the Supreme Court, it forged her partnership with Ben Bradlee in steel. She had proven she had the guts, but that victory came at a price. She made a mortal enemy in the White House, a Richard Nixon who craved revenge. She did not know it, but the Pentagon Papers battle was merely a skirmish. A full-scale war, one that would isolate her, threaten to destroy her company, and test her courage to its core was about to begin, all because of a petty break-in at a complex called Watergate. Katharine Graham stood in her house, phone pressed to her ear, trapped between two worlds. On one side were the voices of the past, of safety, of the wise men, her lawyers and bankers, warning of financial destruction, of jail, of the collapse of her family legacy. They said, "Don't." On the other was the voice of the future, of audacity, of truth, Ben Bradley, roaring over the phone that if she backed down, her paper would be worthless, that she would betray its very reason for being. He said, "Publish." Everything in her 46 years of life, every critique from her mother, every put down from Phil, every condescension from her male peers, had programmed her to listen to the wise men. But the woman who had taken her company public, the woman who had survived suicide and humiliation, was no longer that woman. She took a deep breath. She felt the fear rise, familiar as an old friend. But this time, something else rose alongside it. Anger. She was angry at being cornered, angry at being treated like a child. She trusted Bradley. She trusted her paper. And then she made the decision that reshaped American journalism. Turning to the phone with Bradley, ignoring the screaming objections from her lawyers, she uttered a simple, almost clipped sentence, yet one that carried the weight of history. "Go ahead," she said. "Go ahead. Let's publish." She hung up and immediately felt a wave of nausea from fear. There was no turning back. Hours later, delivery trucks left the printing plant, carrying thousands of pages of classified government material into the streets of Washington. Katharine Graham had just officially declared war on the President of the United States. The Nixon administration's reaction was immediate and devastating. As predicted, the Justice Department sued the Washington Post and received a temporary restraining order, preventing them from further publication. The Washington Post company's newly issued stock plummeted. Kay's investors panicked, believing she had deliberately ruined the company right after taking their money. Kay was isolated. She was risking not just the newspaper, she was risking the entire diversified financial empire, the TV stations, Newsweek magazine her father had built. The legal battle moved at a blinding pace. Within days, the case, consolidated with the New York Times' case, went straight to the Supreme Court. The case of New York Times Company versus United States became the most critical test of the First Amendment in modern history. The question was simple. Did the government have the right to prior restraint a newspaper for national security reasons? For Kay, these were the longest days of her life. The future of her entire company lay in the hands of 9 justices. And then on June 30th, 1971, the ruling came down. In a decisive 6-3 victory, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspapers. They declared the government had not met the burden of proving the direct, immediate, and irreparable threat necessary to justify gagging the press. It was a resounding triumph. The Post newsroom erupted in cheers. Ben Bradley was a hero. But for Kay Graham, it was more than a legal win. It was a profound personal vindication. For the first time in her life, she had gambled everything on her own instinct, against the advice of every wise financial and legal expert. And she had been right. The men had been wrong. She had finally learned to trust her own judgment, and it turned out that voice was powerful. The Kay Bradley partnership was now forged in steel. She had proven to him that she was not just the owner, she was a publisher, an ally ready to fight. But while the newsroom celebrated across town in the White House, a dark fury was brewing. Richard Nixon had not just lost a lawsuit, he had been publicly humiliated by a newspaper he despised, a paper owned by a woman he viewed As part of the liberal Georgetown elite, he hated. President Nixon was caught on Oval Office tapes swearing revenge. He spoke of Kay Graham and the Post with a personal contempt. He ordered his aides to find a way to hurt her. Specifically, he wanted to challenge the license renewal for the Post-owned television stations in Florida. It was an insidious blow. Nixon knew the TV stations, not the paper, were the company's real cash cow. He would hit Kay where it hurt most, her pocketbook. Kay Graham had won the Pentagon Papers battle, but she had created a mortal enemy who was only waiting for his chance to destroy her. She did not have to wait long. Nearly a year passed. Things seemed to settle down. Nixon was preparing for his 1972 re-election campaign and was far ahead in the polls. The Post continued its work. And then, on a June night, June 17, 1972, a seemingly insignificant event occurred. 5 men in suits wearing surgical gloves were arrested attempting to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. Most other newsrooms in the city dismissed it as a quirky local story, a third-rate burglary, as White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler sneered. It was a strange tale that would be forgotten after one news cycle. But at the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, with the instinct of a bloodhound, smelled something rotten. He assigned the story not to his seasoned national political reporters, but to the two most junior, anonymous, and hungry reporters in the newsroom, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And this is where the second and far greater test of Katharine Graham began. This time, she faced no single one-night decision. She faced a lonely, protracted war of attrition that would last nearly 2 years. Woodward and Bernstein, with relentless persistence, began pulling threads. They discovered the burglars had ties to former CIA operatives. They found that one of the burglars had an address book with a White House phone number. They traced a $25,000 check, campaign funds, that had been laundered into one of the burglars' bank accounts. Slowly, piece by piece, they began linking the break-in to the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. And this time, the Post was completely alone. The New York Times, still smarting from being scooped, initially ignored the story. The television networks, the other papers, were covering the presidential campaign, where Nixon was winning overwhelmingly. Only the Washington Post kept digging like a dog with a bone. Every day, Woodward and Bernstein produced a new revelation. And every day the White House fought back. They didn't just deny the story, they attacked the paper itself. Ron Ziegler publicly denounced the Post as shoddy journalism and fake news. Nixon's aides called Kay and her editors screaming threats. Kay Graham's isolation was absolute. Her friends in Washington, the political elite she had dined with for years, began shunning her. They thought she was obsessed, that she was waging a personal vendetta against Nixon. They whispered that she was letting 2 punk reporters ruin her paper. And then the financial strike came. Exactly as Nixon had sworn, his allies in Florida formally challenged the broadcast licenses of the Washington Post Company's 2 most lucrative television stations. This was an overt act of economic warfare. The stock market reacted in a panic. Investors who had just weathered the Pentagon Papers storm now believed Nixon would truly destroy the company. WPO stock, which had been offered at $38, plunged to $21. Millions of dollars of value evaporated. Kay Graham was watching her father's legacy dissolve, all over a story no one else seemed to believe was true. Her bankers called, begging her to stop. Her board members were distraught. They asked her, "Kay, are you sure? Are you really willing to trade the whole company for the story of these 2 29-year-old reporters?" The pressure was unimaginable. It wasn't one night. It was every day, for months. And then it became acutely personal. In a phone call, John Mitchell, the former Attorney General and head of CREEP, who had once been Kay's dinner guest, growled at Carl Bernstein about an upcoming story. When Bernstein did not back down, Mitchell made a threat that would become legendary. He said, "Katie Graham's going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer if that's published." When Bradley relayed the threat to Kay, a silence fell. Katie, the patronizing diminutive name, and the image overtly violent and sexual. It was not a political threat. It was an attack on her gender. It was the final reminder from the Old Boys Club that she was a woman who had gone too far, an outsider who should know her place. Years ago, such a threat might have broken her. It might have confirmed all her fears, causing her to retreat to the safety of Georgetown. But the Kay Graham of 1972 was different. She had survived Phil's humiliation. She had won the Pentagon Papers. The fear was still there. As she admitted, "My stomach was in knots." But she looked that fear in the face. She looked at Ben Bradley, and she looked at her lawyers, and she looked at her panicked bankers. She was risking her family's entire $400 million fortune, all based on her trust in her journalists. She told Bradley, "Publish." The Queen had made her decision. She would not back down. She had chosen her newspaper over her fortune, and in the process, she had set the time bomb that would bring down a president. John Mitchell's "get her tit caught" threat was not an empty insult. It was a declaration of war from the most powerful office on earth. Her decision to continue publishing, even as the stock plummeted and her friends turned away, plunged the Post into a lonely, nearly 2-year-long fight against a freshly re-elected president. This was no longer a quick legal skirmish. This was a psychological war of attrition, a financial siege that would test her resolve to the very end and conclude only when the institution of the American presidency was pushed to the brink of collapse. Katharine Graham's decision, "go ahead," was not an immediate triumph. It was the beginning of a long, lonely war of attrition. The threat of getting her tit caught in a ringer was not hyperbole. It was a declaration of war from the most powerful apparatus on earth. Immediately, the entire machinery of the Nixon White House turned its attention to destroying the Washington Post and the woman at its head. The autumn of 1972 was the darkest time. While Woodward and Bernstein continued to break bombshell stories, linking laundered funds, dirty tricks operations, and high-level officials like John Mitchell, the rest of the country seemed to not care. Richard Nixon was cruising to one of the greatest landslide election victories in U.S. history. In November 1972, he won 49 out of 50 states. The Post's isolation was absolute. They were not just wrong, they looked foolish. The paper was viewed as a bitter, hateful enemy, pursuing a conspiracy theory against a beloved president. Their competitors, including the New York Times, largely remained silent, making the Post look all the more obsessed. Kay Graham was, effectively, a pariah in her own city. Her old Georgetown elite friends, the powerful politicians and social figures, began to avoid her at parties. They did not want to be tainted by her obvious personal war against the president. And the financial attack continued. Just as Nixon swore, his allies in Florida aggressively challenged the television license renewals for the Washington Post Company's 2 most lucrative stations. This was an overt act of economic warfare. The stock market reacted in panic. Investors who had just survived the Pentagon Papers scare now believed Nixon would actually destroy the company. The price of WPO stock, which had sold at $38, plunged to $21. Millions of dollars in value evaporated. Kay Graham was watching her father's legacy dissipate into smoke. all over a story that seemingly no one else believed was true. Her bankers called, begging her to stop. Her board members were frantic. They asked her, "Kay, are you sure? Are you really willing to trade the whole company for these two 29-year-old reporters' story?" The pressure was unimaginable. It wasn't one night. It was every single day for months. And then it became utterly personal. Her old insecurity, the demon that always whispered she wasn't good enough, was now screaming. She wrote that she felt terribly lonely. And then the dam began to crack. The change came not from the press, but from another branch of government, the courts. In January 1973, the Watergate burglars went on trial. Presiding was a tough, no-nonsense federal judge named John J. Sirica. Sirica, a Nixon appointee, listened to the cover story that this was just a third-rate burglary and didn't believe a word of it. He saw these men being paid with huge sums of money, represented by top lawyers, and he knew something much larger was being concealed. He did something extraordinary. He used his sentencing power as leverage. He handed out extremely heavy provisional sentences, up to 40 years, and made it clear he would reconsider leniency if they started telling the truth. The leverage worked. In March 1973, one of the burglars, James McCord, a former CREEP security operative, cracked. He wrote a letter to Judge Sirica. That letter was the bomb that blew the entire conspiracy wide open. McCord claimed he had perjured himself on orders that senior administration officials, including John Dean, the White House counsel, and John Mitchell, the former attorney general, knew about the break-in. He claimed there was a massive top-down cover-up. For Kay Graham and Ben Bradley, it was a moment of pure vindication. They weren't crazy. They weren't obsessed. They were right. Immediately, everything changed. The U.S. Senate, galvanized by McCord's letter, voted to form a special committee to investigate campaign wrongdoing, the Senate Watergate Committee, headed by Senator Sam Ervin. The New York Times, Time, Newsweek, and the TV networks, suddenly awake, jumped onto the story. The Washington Post was no longer alone. They were prophets. The summer of 1973 saw America glued to its TV screens. The Watergate hearings were televised live, and it was a political drama more compelling than any fiction. Day by day, Nixon's aides, one by one, were brought before the cameras and confessed to dirty tricks, slush funds, and an enemies list. The climax was the testimony of John Dean, the White House counsel. For days, in a monotone voice, Dean laid out the entire cover-up conspiracy, describing it chillingly as a cancer on the presidency. And he made it clear. President Richard Nixon knew, was involved in, and directed the cover-up from the beginning. For Kay Graham, this was a transformation. She was no longer the attacker. She was the defender of the Republic. Her newspaper had set this whole process in motion. But even then, it was still Dean's word against the president's. And then, another White House aide, Alexander Butterfield, was asked a seemingly unrelated question. How could Dean recall conversations so precisely? Butterfield stammered out the White House's most closely guarded secret. There was an automatic voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. Everything had been recorded. The tapes existed. The game changed completely. The battle was no longer over testimony. It was over who would get those tapes. A new special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, was appointed and immediately subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon, citing executive privilege, refused. The country was heading toward a constitutional crisis. Richard Nixon, cornered, decided to brutally counterattack. On the Saturday night of October 20th, 1973, a night that would become known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Archibald Cox. Richardson, believing the order was unethical, resigned in protest. Nixon then ordered the Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also resigned, finally. A third official, Robert Bork, complied and fired Cox. It was a desperate, tyrannical act. The White House exploded. The American public was appalled. They had watched their president fire the very man investigating him. This was no longer about a burglary. This was about absolute abuse of power. Calls for impeachment began to ring like thunder. Throughout this constitutional firestorm, Kay Graham and Ben Bradlee held the line. The Post, now regarded as the nation's voice, led the editorials demanding accountability, demanding a new special prosecutor. Kay was no longer afraid. She had risked everything, and now she would see it through. She had crossed the point of personal fear. She had realized the story was bigger than her company, bigger than herself. It was about democracy. The battle for the tapes continued in the courts for nearly a year. A new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, continued the fight. Finally, in July 1974, the Supreme Court in United States v. Nixon handed down its ruling. In a unanimous 8-0 decision, they ordered Richard Nixon to surrender the tapes. Even his own appointees voted against him. Days later, the White House released the transcript of the so-called smoking gun tape. It was recorded just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. On the tape, President Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, can be heard discussing using the CIA to stop the FBI from investigating the break-in, not for national security but for political reasons. It was the irrefutable evidence. He had obstructed justice from the start. His Republican allies in Congress, who had defended him for months, turned on him en masse. Impeachment was inevitable. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, announced his resignation. The next day, Kay Graham and Ben Bradlee stood in the noisy newsroom of the Post, looking through Bradlee's office window as the Marine One helicopter lifted Richard Nixon off the White House lawn for the last time. The reporters in the newsroom began to cheer, but Kay and Bradlee did not celebrate. They simply stood and watched. Bradlee later said it was a horrible moment. Kay felt similarly. She did not feel triumphant. She felt a deep sadness for the country. She hadn't been in this to bring down a president. She had been in it to find the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was ugly and tragic. In that moment, Katharine Graham's transformation was complete. The timid woman who was once terrified to walk into her own boardroom, who had been humiliated by her husband and threatened by politicians, now stood silently as the single woman in U.S. history who played the central role in the removal of a president. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to brag. She had simply done her job. She had proven that the press, when backed by an owner with courage, was truly a pillar of democracy. She had found her voice, and that voice had changed the world. With Richard Nixon's resignation, Katharine Graham stood on top of the world. She had won. She was vindicated. The shy widow had become the most powerful symbol of the free press. But absolute power brings absolute complications. Now, with no clear enemy like Nixon to fight, Kay's legacy became more complex. She was no longer the underdog. She was the establishment. And her subsequent battles would not be over high ideals, but ruthless clashes over money, technology, and her own place among Washington's powerful elite. Richard Nixon's resignation in August 1974 was more than the fall of a president. It was the coronation of a queen. Katharine Graham, the shy widow who once feared asking questions in meetings, was now the most powerful and perhaps most admired woman in the United States. She had outgrown the timid shadow she once was. She was Mrs. Graham, and the title was now spoken with unmistakable reverence. Her Washington Post was no longer a second-tier local paper. It was the paper that brought down a corrupt administration. She had become the living embodiment of a free press, a guardian of the First Amendment. Ben Bradlee was her sword, but she was the steady hand that held it. She had reached the absolute pinnacle, but history is rarely so simple. Power is never a clean white cloak. It always carries its own weight and stains. The second phase of Kay Graham's life, the post-Watergate era, was her most complex. She was no longer fighting a clear enemy like Nixon. She had to fight the messy realities of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And it was in these fights that her image from a liberal saint defending truth became far more complicated. Critics began to ask, who was she really? An idealist journalist or a hard-nosed capitalist? A defender of democracy? Or simply the most powerful member of the very elite she claimed to oversee? The first great post-Watergate battle was not with the White House, but with her own labor force. It occurred in 1975, and it nearly destroyed the paper again. It was the pressmen's strike. To understand this conflict, we need to understand technology. For decades, newspapers were printed using 19th century hot type technology, massive, complex linotype machines that cast lines of text from molten lead. This work was done by highly skilled pressmen's unions who passed the trade down from father to son. These unions, particularly Local 6, were among the most powerful in the country. They controlled the press room. They dictated who worked for how long and under what rules. They could cripple the paper at any moment, and they knew it. But in the 1970s, a technological revolution was underway. Cold type and offset printing driven by computers. It was faster, cheaper, and did not require an army of skilled pressmen. Ben Bradlee and the editors could send their stories directly to the typesetter. To Kay Graham, as a CEO, adopting this new technology was not a choice. It was survival. Competitors were doing it, and if the Post didn't, they would be financially obsolete and go broke. The pressmen's union saw their end coming. They saw that computers would wipe out their jobs, their entire way of life. They decided to fight to the death. Contract negotiations in 1975 were intensely bitter. Kay and her managers offered lifetime job guarantees for all current pressmen, but demanded control of the press room and the right to bring in the new technology. The union refused. They wanted to maintain their absolute power. On the night of October 1st, 1975, when the contract expired, the union acted. But this was no peaceful strike. This was a calculated act of sabotage. Before walking out, the pressmen launched a brutal attack on the very lifeblood of the paper. They destroyed the printing presses. They smashed key parts with hammers and crowbars. They set fires in the paper storage room, causing millions of dollars in damage. They attempted to literally kill the paper at its source. This was a defining moment for Kay Graham. It was even harder than Watergate. In Watergate, she was a hero fighting a corrupt government. The moral choice was clear. But this time, she, a liberal Democrat icon who supported social movements, was pitted against a labor union. She was being attacked by the very people her political ideology purported to protect. The saboteurs underestimated her. They thought the wealthy liberal widow would panic, would buckle under the pressure. They thought she didn't have the stomach for a fight. They were tragically wrong. The woman facing them was not the timid Kay Meyer. It was Kay Graham, the CEO. She didn't view this as a labor dispute. She viewed it as an act of terrorism, a personal violation of her father's paper. She was furious. Steely Kay, the nickname she had earned during Watergate, was now fully unleashed. She did the unthinkable. She decided to publish the next day without them. For months prior, in absolute secrecy, Kay and her managers had prepared for this possibility. They had secretly flown a crew of non-union pressmen to a remote training facility in Oklahoma to learn how to operate the new presses. They had planned a military-style operation. That night, when the strike began, the plan was activated. Managers, editors, and even reporters, people who had never touched a press, poured into the press room, trying to put out fires and clean up the mess. Simultaneously, Kay had helicopters fly the replacement pressmen onto the roof of the Post building to bypass the violent picket lines below. They turned the Washington Post into a besieged fortress. And the next morning, a miracle occurred. The Washington Post appeared on newsstands. It was thin, riddled with errors, but it was there. Kay Graham had sent a message. She would not be intimidated. She would not let her company be destroyed. The strike lasted 139 days. It was a bitter fight. Picket lines turned violent. Delivery trucks were burned. Workers were threatened. But Kay did not budge. She hired a private security army. She went to court and got injunctions against the union's violence. And she continued to publish the paper every single day. She broke the union. Eventually, the pressmen's union collapsed. Kay had won. She had financially saved the paper and catapulted it into the modern era. But the personal and ideological price was enormous. She was condemned by the entire labor movement. Her liberal friends in Washington were appalled. How could the saint of Watergate be such a ruthless union buster? This is the core historical argument about her dual nature. Was she an idealist journalist or a pragmatic capitalist? The answer, it turned out, was both. She believed in a free press, but she knew a free press could only survive if it was profitable. She would protect the First Amendment at all costs, but she would protect her bottom line with the same tenacity. The 1975 strike completed her transformation, from frightened widow to heroic publisher, and finally to a hardened, powerful CEO. The second controversy about her legacy is more subtle and quiet, but no less important. It is the accusation that she and the Post were too cozy with the very power they were supposed to oversee, especially with the intelligence community. This is not a simple accusation. It stemmed from her late husband, Phil Graham. Phil was a fervent Cold Warrior. He was a close friend of CIA founders like Allen Dulles and Frank Wisner. He was a strong believer in the agency's mission. Some historians like Deborah Davis have alleged that Phil Graham even actively collaborated with the CIA in Operation Mockingbird, an alleged CIA program to recruit American journalists to spread propaganda and gather intelligence. When Kay took over, she inherited these relationships. She was personally close to many powerful figures in Washington, including those in the intelligence community. She frequently hosted dinners where the director of the CIA, senators, and top journalists would meet and informally exchange information. Critics, such as journalist Carl Bernstein, later argued that this intimacy was a problem. How could the Washington Post objectively investigate the CIA when its owner was personal friends with the CIA director? Critics pointed out that throughout the 1970s, as major CIA scandals broke, the Post was often slower than other papers, or seemed to minimize the severity of the stories. Kay Graham vehemently denied any formal collusion. She maintained that she never compromised the paper's independence. She argued that her job as the publisher in Washington was to know everyone. How could she cover a city whose movers and shakers she didn't talk to? She believed her dinners were not collusion. They were journalistic intelligence gathering. But the historical argument remains. Even if there was no formal conspiracy, did this culture of intimacy create an unconscious self-censorship? Did reporters hesitate to dig too deeply into the friends of their boss? This is a core contradiction in Kay's power. She became so powerful that she became the very establishment she was overseeing. She was no longer the outsider fighting her way in. She was the supreme gatekeeper. The final controversy is the one that still lingers today, the accusation of liberal bias. To American conservatives, the Washington Post was not an objective arbiter. It was the weapon of the Democratic Party. They viewed Watergate not as an act of pure journalism, but as a politically motivated coup to bring down a Republican president the Georgetown elite hated. They pointed to Kay's personal friendships with John F. Kennedy, with Lyndon B. Johnson, with Robert McNamara. They argued the paper was soft on Democratic failures, while pursuing Republicans like Nixon with relentless ferocity. Kay always dismissed this. She maintained that she believed in a wall of separation between the editorial page and the newsroom. She pointed out that the Post also ran stories damaging to Democrats. For her, the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers, an act that targeted both Democratic and Republican administrations, was the final proof of her independence. But the perception endures. Kay Graham, once an invisible widow, had become a symbol so large, so powerful, that she could not escape the accusations that she was abusing that power. She had learned the final lesson of power. When you reach the top, you no longer have simple enemies. Every decision you make is a controversy, and your legacy will be forever debated. So, her legacy is complex. A tough-minded capitalist who broke a union, a member of the elite accused of being too close to power. These controversies define her complexity as a CEO, but her historical significance transcends business decisions or Georgetown dinners. Her enduring legacy lies not just in what she did as a publisher, but in who she was, a woman who broke every barrier. And finally, she performed her most courageous act, not by publishing others' secrets, but by exposing her own most painful ones. When Richard Nixon flew away in disgrace, Katharine Graham did not simply return to her life. She became, almost overnight, the most powerful woman in the United States. Some even called her the most powerful woman in the world. Her paper, the Washington Post, was no longer a rival to the New York Times. It had become a global symbol of a free press, a force capable of holding the most powerful executive on earth to account. She was no longer Little Kay or Phil's widow. She was Mrs. Graham, and the title was now spoken with unmistakable deference. Her most immediate and tangible legacy, of course, was the seismic shift in American journalism. Watergate ushered in a new era. It transformed investigative reporting from a newsroom backwater into the craft's highest form. Every small local paper in America now wanted its own I-team. Every young journalism student wanted to be Woodward or Bernstein. The relationship between the press and the government was forever fractured. The easy trust of the Kennedy era was gone, replaced by a healthy and sometimes acrimonious skepticism. Kay Graham, by backing her reporters, equipped the press with a new, sharper set of teeth. But perhaps the deeper, more personal legacy is what she did for women. This is complicated. Kay Graham never intended to be a feminist icon. In fact, she was often uncomfortable with the surging women's liberation movement. She was of an older generation, one that believed in working within the system. Yet, she became its most potent accidental symbol. She was not just a woman in the boardroom. She was the woman who owned the boardroom. In 1972, amidst the Watergate storm, she broke one of the final barriers. She became the first female CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She did it not by shouting slogans, but by simply doing her job, a job harder than any man on that list faced. She proved that a woman could lead not just with grace or intuition, but with absolute toughness, financial courage, and moral resolve. She normalized female power at the highest level. She was the queen who needed no crown. And then late in life, she solidified that legacy with an act arguably more courageous than publishing the Pentagon Papers. In 1997, at age 80, she published her autobiography, Personal History. The world expected a dignified, carefully curated memoir of a grande dame. Instead, Kay Graham gave them one of the most honest, painful, and self-exposing books ever written by a public figure. She tore down the curtain. She wrote with astonishing frankness about her icy childhood, about her mother's cruel criticism. She wrote about her crippling insecurity, the feeling of being a fool in her own home. And most importantly, she wrote about Phil. She did not whitewash her marriage. She wrote about her great love for him, but she also wrote about his mental illness, his verbal abuse, the public humiliation of the affair, and the utter horror of the day he killed himself. She exposed her greatest wound to the world. The book was a literary earthquake. It was an instant bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize. But its impact was greater than that. By admitting her deep fear and insecurity, Kay Graham did something revolutionary. She gave permission to other powerful women to be vulnerable. She destroyed the myth that to be a leader, you had to be an impenetrable block of steel. She proved that true greatness lay not in the absence of fear, but in the ability to act despite it. The book was her final victory, not over Richard Nixon, but over her own ghosts, over the voices of her mother and her husband that told her she wasn't good enough. She finally told her own story on her own terms. This brings us back to the black and white ball. We can now see the true genius in Truman Capote's choice. Why did he honor Katharine Graham? Capote, a keen observer of power and fragility, saw what no one else could see in 1966. He saw a woman standing on the precipice of greatness, one who was hiding a steely strength beneath a timid exterior. The party is remembered as the last ball of Capote's America because it was the final glorious gasp of an age of innocence, a world of New York high society that believed style and society were everything. But Kay Graham was the future. She was the symbol of a new era, one where real power came not from what party you attended, but from the decisions you made under pressure. She was the only woman in that room who would soon prove she was more important than every politician, movie star, and swan combined. Capote wasn't throwing a party for the woman she was. He was throwing a party for the woman she was about to become. She was the bridge between the old world of style and the new world of substance, and she was the only one who belonged to both. Katharine Graham died in 2001 at 84 after a tragic fall. Her funeral was a national event, a testament to the extraordinary life she had lived. It brought together politicians from both parties, the journalists she had mentored, and the women she had inspired. She did not die as Phil's widow or Eugene's daughter. She died as Kay Graham, arguably the most important and consequential American publisher of the 20th century. Ultimately, her story is not about politics or journalism. It is a profound story of human psychology. It is a story of transformation. It is about a woman who went through the worst personal tragedy imaginable: parental rejection, abuse from her beloved husband, his suicide, and instead of being destroyed by it, she slowly, painfully rebuilt herself from the ashes. She turned her unspeakable pain into an unbreakable strength. The queen needed no crown because her power was not inherited. It was earned. It was not given to her by her father. He gave it to Phil. It was taken from her by her husband. She had to take it back herself piece by piece in stuffy boardrooms, in brutal union fights, and in the empty halls of the Supreme Court. Kay Graham's lesson is simple and profound. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act even when you are shaking with it. The small woman who spent the first 46 years of her life believing her voice did not matter finally found it. And when she spoke, that voice was powerful enough to bring down a president and change the way we understand the truth forever.